we will be developing. And the way I'm going to do this today is organize it around four major developments that are happening at the same time, interacting with one another, but together give us a clear sense of where this new world economic order is coming. Okay, we begin. Over the last 30, 40, 50 years, depending on how you count, we have been involved in what is called neoliberal capitalism, or if you like, global capitalism. And here's really all that that meant: that coming out of the Great Depression and World War II, private led capitalism had a new chance to rebuild after the war, to try to recoup after the Great Depression, and to have another growth spurt, which it did. By the 1970s, that growth spurt was beginning to have a problem keeping going. Not unusual in the history of capitalism as a system. It is growth spurt driven. But after the 1970s, the growth spurt took an unusual form. Where before capitalism had spurted from New England to the Midwest, from the Midwest to the far West, from all of those areas to the American South, now after the 1960s and 70s, capitalism's next growth spurt was out of the country, to Asia above all else, but also to the other parts of what has come to be called the global South. More money was to be made there. Wages were much cheaper there. Environmental protection less there. And governments everywhere eager to
So I'll
provide
share my
jobs for
screen
their
if you want to look.
people, and American corporations, just like European and Japanese corporations, eager to have access to cheaper labor, eager to have access to huge Asian markets. And so neoliberal globalization took hold. Huge numbers of jobs moved from the old centers of capitalism, Western Europe, North America, Japan, to the new dynamic centers, China, India, Brazil, and so on. A remarkable process of explosive growth. And in this situation, we find ourselves living with the results of that process. The first result: a hollowing out of the old working class in the old centers of capitalism. What do I mean? I mean that jobs left. The jobs that left first, say from the United States, were the highest paid. The unionized jobs, the factory jobs, where workers' struggles had built up decent livelihoods for people. That's where there was the most gain in profit if you could move that production to the cheap labor in other parts of the world. And so we lost our steel factories, our auto factories, our aluminum production, all of the basic industry of the country. Why? Because it was profitable for capitalists to move, and move they did. And the middle class fell apart. The jobs disappeared. From being a high paid industrial worker, you became a low paid greeter at Walmart, etc., etc. Inequality grew because the 10% who own all the shares made
Check.
all the big profits, and the mass of the working class took a real hit because those in America had to compete with the cheaper labor in China, India, and we all know the result. And it had one more effect: it created capitalist powers
Mm,
outside of the United States, Europe, and Japan, who hadn't seen that before. China, above all, but also India, Brazil, and others emerging. So that the Western
so I'll
capitalist
just add the
old
rook.
centers had a dynamic new center competing with them. These were very new developments. One of the things provoked by it, an upsurge of militant labor movements. No surprise, they were reacting to the hard times working classes are facing, one after the other, all over the world. Even in China and India, because of the sudden transformation of agrarian people into industrial working classes, that always shakes people's lives, that always creates tension. And in the West, the disappearing jobs, the disappearing middle class, the disappearing standards of living, the disappearing opportunities for children.
I guess he'll just fucking
Capitalism in the West was under strain.
probably just play Rook C1, Bishop
Let me
C3.
assure you that the rising militancy of the labor movement here in this country, led by service workers among the lowest paid, should be no surprise.
Yeah,
The
94 was
fact
kind
that
of meh.
France as a whole country is shut down by the demand of its working classes not to have the problems of your French capitalism taken out on them by taking away the pensions they've already paid for.
I don't know, Queen
Or
D6
the
though.
Germans who last a month shut down the transportation system in their country as a protest against the inflations attacking the working class. And I'll come back to that. We had a shift
Yeah, so he has to take with the
from
pawn.
globalized neoliberal expansion to its opposite, retraction, countries fighting against one another, the United States shutting down, hobbling interactions with China.
And then this pawn is hanging.
Economic nationalism replaced neoliberal globalization. Europe is caught between, trying to figure out what to do. Should it still stay with the United States, doing a lot of its dirty work politically, as in Ukraine? Or is the future of Europe better with the new centers? That issue is being fought out in Europe, even if the media in this country pretend otherwise. And then there's the isolation of the United States. This is important to understand and
Resigned.
brings us as a transition to another of the four factors, besides the shift from neoliberal globalization to economic nationalism. We're also seeing the end of a century in which we were told, and many of us believed, that the great struggle was between the state as an owner-operator of enterprises and the private sector as the owner-operator of the enterprises
sing an
that produce
E4.
goods and services. We were told this was the struggle between capitalism and socialism. And we've learned that that was a terrible mistake. Capitalism has a private form and a state form, just like slavery did, just like feudalism did. Let me drive the point home. During slaveries around the world, were there private slavers, masters who were private individuals running a business with slaves? Yes. Were there governments who had and operated slave enterprises? Yes. Nobody thinks that it wasn't slavery because the state was doing it alongside the private sector. Same in
That worked.
feudalism. We had state feudal, state lords with serfs, and private lords with serfs. And guess what? There's a pattern here. You start off typically with only the private, but the private gets itself into trouble and calls in the state. And so you get state slavery alongside private. Same thing, you get state feudalism alongside private. And guess what? When private capitalism gets into trouble, it calls in the state. That's why Mr. Trump had to wage tariff wars and trade wars, and Mr. Biden is doing basically the same. You call in the state, and the state then becomes a bigger and bigger factor. We're seeing the end of the big story of private versus state.
But I don't think he
Because in
castled, right?
fact, All the societies are combinations, mixtures of those.
Yeah, he took on c5.
The United States has a bigger and bigger role for the state. The Republicans complain about it, the Democrats push it, but they all accept it and they all understand it has to be done, even if they give speeches to the contrary on the 4th of July. The greatest example of the hybrid, the combination of private and state capitalist enterprises is the People's Republic of China. By capitalist, I mean the
E4 is the main
relationship
move.
between the employer and the employee. That's the issue.
See, but he played
Socialism wants to change that relationship,
a3.
make it more collective, make it more democratic, make it more a relation of equals, not a relation of hierarchical, dominant, subordinate. That's not what capitalism allows, neither in its private form nor in its state form. What China has showed is that you can get a more rapid rate of growth with the hybrid, understanding its peculiarities, than you can if it's all state, like Russia, Soviet Russia, or all private, more like the United States and the United Kingdom. So they've become the model. And the United States denounces China as it becomes more of a hybrid itself. If you can't beat them, you end up joining them. I think that's an important thing for us to understand, that in the New World Order, we have economic nationalism and a hybrid of state and private employer-employee capitalism. Whatever names they give themselves, whatever their ultimate goals may be, these are the realities that we